Ishe Andrew Curley Nishe Bilagana Nishle, Hanagani Basichin Bilagana Dashache Ki Ani Dashanale. I am a member of the Navajo Nation. My name is Andrew Curley. I am an assistant professor in the School of Geography, Development, and Environment at the University of Arizona. And it's a good event, or nice to be able to present virtually and through this pre-recorded setting at the American Geographical Society Geography 2050 towards a more equitable future. And I put the data sometime in the past because when you're watching this, I will be in the past tense. So very interesting temporal moment here. Just kidding. So anyway, the title of my presentation is The Central Arizona Project and the Taking of Navajo Resources. And the reason why I'm focusing on the Central Arizona Project is because this is like my new research. This is where my research is going, builds off of my previous work in the Navajo Nation on energy and energy development around coal within the reservation, and the coal mines that I have focused on have since closed. But what the Central Arizona Project does for me is it allows me to think more historically about an unequal society, an unequal place in the Southwest, especially around water access and development. And this has to do with indigenous nations, particularly the Navajo Nation in this case, and the rest of the state of Arizona as a settler colonial project. And so what I intend to show you in this presentation is how structural inequality is built into federal Indian policy, development approaches within Indian policy, and water resource development within the Southwest. So all of those things combined create the unequal inequality landscape that is a focus of this year's conference. So just to give you some theoretical language with which to understand this project, I look at the Central Arizona Project through the literature on infrastructures, and I'm coining this idea of infrastructures as a colonial beachhead, and it's kind of an awkward terminology and maybe not the best use of words, but it's this idea of infrastructures not only as creating inequality between two places, but in the case of indigenous nations, infrastructures creep across our reservations, they surround us, they choke our land claims, and funnel out our resources towards other projects. So so the intent of this metaphor of a beachhead is to think about infrastructures as establishing a colonial claim within and around Indian nations, and then building on that, making new kinds of dispossession possible off of the initial claim. So for example, when we're looking at the Navajo Nation, we're thinking about the history of westward expansion in the form of rail lines, rail expansion, rail development, which led to certain kinds of land claims, formalization of reservation boundaries that inform the legal background of water regimes that develop post the railroad in the state of Arizona, California, Nevada, Utah, and then those legal claims become basis of denying indigenous water claims. The way in which land is given a date, established through formalization of boundaries and territorialization in the form of reservation lines, and the establishment date of those reservation boundaries, which translates into water law in a certain way, especially when we're thinking about priority dates and who gets what kind of priority dates, who has access to the Colorado River and other kinds of water sources within the Southwest. So this is the stuff that we're looking at through infrastructure. So they not only create inequality, they actually create the possibilities for colonialism to extend and to build off of each other, and they might not be the same infrastructures over time. So in the case of this example, which I'll show, is that we're talking about rail and urbanization in places like Phoenix and Tucson, which then leads to water infrastructure and coal and pipelines and transmission lines later on. So let's see, what's the next slide? We're also understanding this through the way time works, the way time is used and displaced with how we understand the work of these infrastructures. So Dr. Sarah Smith and I Dr. Smith is at UNC Chapel Hill in the geography department, and we're collaborating on a couple of papers where we think about seeing time and seeing temporalities, and that's to think about this idea of the Anthropocene, Capitalocene, Plantationocene, and how they incorporate certain understandings of time with a directionality, with a teleology in some instances of like, this is where we're going. And therefore, these are kind of the solutions that are available. So for example, if we think about the Anthropocene, and then we think about how our climate change language and discourse is always future oriented, is always anticipating new technologies, the advancement of new technologies that don't exist but are foreseen to happen to be available in the future. That's how we're planning around this current climate crisis. That's how we're planning around water resources and water distribution. And this kind of future orientation of solutions ignores the existing inequalities within our social landscape. So ignores the colonial displacements that happened in the past. So, indigenous scholarship, people working in indigenous environments will show you that actually, all of our crises are not in the future. They're not things that are happening now or in the very near future with melting of glaciers or desertification or drought or any of these other kind of markers that are part of our climate change discourse. But in fact, many of our environmental crises go back 100 years or more to the establishment of land regimes, dispossession of land, displacement from homelands, the polluting of lakes, the damming of rivers, the flooding of fields, like we've experienced. And this is building off the work of Potawatomi scholar Kyle White, kind of inspirational way of thinking about this problem. But what he writes is that we've experienced these kind of worst effects of environmental catastrophe, and they're not like in the near future, but in the past, and that those past colonial dispossessions are still law, they're still policy, they're still part of the way that the federal government and the state governments interact and deal with Indian tribes. And so that's something that we need to think about when we're thinking through how time, temporality works within our climate change and our scene narrative. So those are the things that actually influence the way we understand some of these crises happening today. And let me get into my example. Here's a map of the Navajo Nation in the colonial states of Arizona, New Mexico, parts of Utah, and with no reservation boundaries in Colorado. As you can see, these were denied to us, even though two of our important landmarks are found in southwestern Colorado. We have no reservation lands there. But this is to give you a sense of where the Navajo Nation is, how we conceptualize space, how we think about our reservation. And I kind of wanted to center our own geography of it, not this common orientation, which is like, here it is within this colonial landscape, but actually this is our homeland, and this is how we understand our territory. And something that is important to note here is that within our reservation, we can see we're just crisscrossed with colonial demarcations, colonial lines. Even right here we have Utah, Colorado, New Mexico, and Arizona. And when we're talking about the diversion and the establishment and the claims of water rights, all of these become subject to these colonial jurisdictions, including water basins. So halfway through the reservation, we end up being between the upper basin and lower basin as well. And these are all colonial mappings. They're not things that we establish. When we've been living in this area for hundreds of years, this is not, well, not exactly like this, but this is where we were, and this is how we understood our space. And then all of these kind of maps oversected on top of our lands, and then consequently reduced the kind of political voice that we have within the federal state process. So we'll show you that in some more detail. To give you a little bit of context about some of the resource claims and resource grabs within Indian country, we have, this is a map that I was able to just use from the Energy Information Agency webpage to show how resources within the United States are often found within and around Indian lands. And so the purple spaces are reservation lands, and in this case, these are where coal mines and where coal reserves and power plants are located. And where I did my research on coal was here. It's hard to see because of the way that the purple and the gray kind of are not so distinguishable from each other as colors, but that's the former Kayenta mine and Black Mesa mine. And this triangle within a black circle was the Navajo generating station, which was demolished earlier this year. And this whole coal economy, as I'll show in the rest of the presentation, was built in order to create power for a water pipeline that services Phoenix and Tucson. And so this will show you the inequality between the state of Arizona and tribes, and how our water rights are put off for the benefit of Phoenix and Tucson. And just for another example, this is where oil and natural gas are found, and then also where pipeline networks are being built. And you may have heard a lot about environmental contestation about some of the expansion of some of these indigenous opposition to some of these pipelines. Like this right here is the Dakota Access Pipeline going north of the Standing Rock Sioux Tribe's reservation, which is this purple area here. And then we have Line 3 in Minnesota. I don't think it's represented on this graph, but I think it follows much of the existing infrastructure here. So that's been in the news a lot, and that's just to give you a sense of where this oil is being transported and how it's intersecting within Indian lands. And as you can see, we have existing pipeline infrastructure in the reservation, and all of this kind of drains out into the Gulf of Mexico, with where some of these notoriously evil companies are located, like in Houston. So anyway, so the construction of a dystopic Arizona, this is when I wanted to go back and build off of Kyle White's work and others, that I mentioned earlier, about how we understand dystopia and climate change, and how we're thinking about some of these crises. And one of the things that happened, especially in the early or the mid 20th century, was a lot of state planning around the development of large infrastructure projects that were servicing new and expanding communities in the western states, what some of these cities called the Sun Belt, including Phoenix and Tucson and Las Vegas and Denver. New arms industry moved into these places, military bases, other kinds of businesses. So there was a new kind of development imperative and a new kind of planning that was at work. And part of the need for these cities to expand was water, also like preventing new kinds of flooding, or old kinds of flooding, I should say, the way that preventing the natural movement of rivers, how rivers tend to change course over years. There's floodplains around rivers that are known. And all of these things had to be engineered to be predictable and to be service of settler colonial communities, new communities that didn't exist before much of the 20th century, including places like Page, Arizona, which was built around the construction of a dam, and a community, that now has water rights to the Colorado River, while the Navajo Nation still to this day doesn't have water rights to the Colorado River. So that gives you an example of how these colonial communities are getting first priority for natural resources, and while indigenous nations are paying the cost. So we have, what are these images? We have the signing of the Pixlr Act, which flooded thousands of acres of Indian land, grazing lands, agricultural lands, in order to create hydroelectric power along the Missouri River, and also to prevent flooding in places like Omaha, and to benefit institutions like the Army Corps of Engineers, who were part of, who benefited from building the construction contracts that went into to building these dams and diversions. And so that's the black and white images that you see on the right hand side are images from that time. It's 1944, 1945 era. And then on the left is a map that I found in the archives at the University of Arizona, where I'm at. These were from the papers of the former Secretary of Interior, Stuart Udall. And he has a map of all the major drainage areas in the Western United States. And in this particular file, what he's doing at this time, this was in the early 60s, is he's thinking about these like interlocking waterways and where he can move water across much of the West. And as you can see, the Colorado Basin and the Columbia Basin are adjacent. We don't always think about these rivers as being near each other, but in this map, in the way that the water is presented here, they're adjacent. And one of the schemes that Udall had at the time was to create this network of pipelines and canals to bring water from the Columbia Basin into the Colorado Basin in order to offset some of the water needs in the drier parts of the colonial United States. And so this was in service of places like Arizona, California, Southern California, and using some of the waters from the Pacific Northwest and to bring them into the South. It was like this really crazy environmental engineering project that was this high modernist ideal behind it, and about with this hubris of being able to transform nature around human need. And in this case, human stands for white needs, white community needs. And so this is something that was like part of the thinking and the process of development in the mid part of the 20th century, in this case, the early 1960s, and with little thought or concern about how this might impact indigenous nations, indigenous tribes who didn't have water claims, whose rights to these waters were not recognized, but the rights to these waters divided among the various states, and especially in the Southwest in the Colorado Compact, which I'll explain in a second. So here's another example of some of this mapping and how this environmental engineering was being thought of at the time. And this is from that same archive. So eventually what Udall does is, that this basin project failed because of the political problems that are presented, especially between the states. The states didn't want to share a lot of this information, so that's why they weren't able to do that. But in okay, as my father-in-law, so sorry for the interruption. So this is what happens when you present from home. But so what we have here is a project to move water from. Can I pause for a second? Sorry.
Yes, of course.
Yeah. Okay, I need to restart the slide. So if you can re-edit this.
Yeah, we can totally do that. No worries.
Yeah. I didn't. He was sleeping, and then came in, and then he was kind of staring at me while I was presenting for the last 2 minutes, so it was a little bit awkward. Okay, I'm going to start again in 4 seconds. Okay, so when we're moving from the board report, when we're moving from the projects that were proposed for this interbasin transfer of water. At the same time, Arizona and other states wanted to develop their water resource, their water claims to the Colorado River. And one of the major projects at that time, one of the long-standing projects that the state of Arizona wanted to accomplish was the Central Arizona Project. It's a pipeline that takes water from the Colorado River and moves it in the opposite direction in which it flows toward Phoenix, going eastward, and then into Tucson as a regular supply of water, because these expanding communities were using up a lot of their groundwater. They were reliant on groundwater, and those resources were fast depleting. Now, at the same time, like I said, Navajo water rights and other Indian water rights were not recognized, they were not formalized along the Colorado River according to water law. And the water law is a Colorado Compact. It's an agreement between the 7 Colorado Basin states, between them, about who gets how much water. And since then, all of tribal Indian water claims have gone through the framework of the Colorado Compact. So any kind of water that's being given to tribes in the form of an Indian water settlement is coming out of whatever number of acre feet a year that state has in its budget, in its water budget. So, the Navajo Nation, if it's taking water out of the lower basin, that's coming out of Arizona's claim. So all of these states still have the total claim. Between the 7 of them, they have the total amount of water for the Colorado River. And then they just allow the tribes within their jurisdictions, within their territorial claims, some access to water, but they have first priority over tribes. They are the ones that have the political weight over tribes in these cases. And so this is already setting up an unequal landscape with access to water. So what happens is in 1967, because of the politics between the state of California, Colorado, and Arizona, the proposed Central Arizona Project is being built instead of this large interlocking water canal between the Columbia Basin and the Colorado River Basin. And also this pipe is being built in order to service Arizona communities and realize Arizona's lower basin water rights. But it needs the support of the states of California and Utah and others in order to get this through Congress, in order for Congress to pass money to fund this project. And part of the opposition was a couple of proposed dams around the Colorado, around the Grand Canyon, that would serve as a source of power for this movement of water going from west to east in kind of the opposite direction, and from the way that the Colorado River flows. You have to move that water, physically move that water over a lot of landscape, going up elevation before it descends into the Salt River Valley. So you need energy to pump that water up, and the energy source was thought to be these power plants, these hydroelectric plants around the Grand Canyon. But environmental groups like the Sierra Club and others opposed it because of the way that environmentalism understood landscapes at that time, and the naturalness and the preservation of places, and not even thinking about kind of the social cost for marginalized groups like the Navajo Nation and other tribes in the Grand Canyon, tribes around the Grand Canyon, and other people in the state. And so that's, the opposition was based solely on an aesthetic of the canyon. And so what was proposed in lieu of these dams was a coal-fired power plant, what became the Navajo Generating Station. And this is the first time that this power plant enters a conversation in this report that I found in Stuart Udall's papers. And this is, you can see right here, the thermal power plant location proposed. So what I'm getting at is, like, these infrastructures are working together. they're working together, and one is, giving the Navajo Nation opportunity to develop its coal resources, to to get jobs and whatever revenues from the in the form of a new coal economy, while at the same time, destroying much of the landscape through strip mining, and also creating new kinds of health hazards by coal dust and other kinds of coal ash, coal that's burned and then removed from the power plant, and then those kinds of air, things can get in the air and affect communities around. So that, we have multiple sources of pollution now, and on top of the emissions that are coming out of the smokestack. So all of these things are new kinds of hazards, and the hazards are assumed by the Dene people, the Navajo people, while the benefits of these projects are going towards Phoenix and Tucson. At the same time, this project also offset Navajo claims to the Colorado River. So in order for certain Congress people, in this case Wayne Aspinall, who was a Colorado congressperson and head of the Congressional Insular Committee in Congress, which is a committee no longer exists, but was powerful at that time in moving a legislation forward. He put a provision within a demand, actually, within the lease that the Navajo Nation sets aside 3,400 acre feet of water a year, which is more than the Navajo generating station needs, as a form of operations. But really, what is being done is that water is being set aside in order that the state of Arizona doesn't overdevelop and overuse its water, and that there's still enough water left for upper basin users. So it was a way to balance off the needs of the state of Colorado, Utah, Wyoming, upper basin users against lower basin users, California, Nevada, in this case, Arizona, and with the Navajo Nation picking up the tab, paying the costs in the form of their water rights. So the lease was signed in 1969. This was first, these projects were being developed in 67, but the lease was signed 69. And in that lease, the 3,400 acre feet a year of Colorado River water, 1 acre foot is like 3,000 gallons, just to give you a sense of how much water we're talking about. All of that water was set aside for 50 years. And 50 years, the Navajo Nation couldn't touch that water, so long as that power plant's operating. So we were forfeiting our claims to water for 50 years in order to have this power plant, which was ultimately serving the water interests of the state of Arizona, and had some benefit for the Navajo Nation, but proportionally had much more benefit for the state of Arizona. So that gives you a sense of how these in unequal and in how unequal landscapes manifest, and how inequality reproduces itself between tribes and settler colonial communities, with the way that the federal power gives states certain kinds of authorities that tribes don't have, through racist laws like the doctrine of discovery, domestic dependent ideas between the tribes and the federal government that go back to the 1830s. And these laws are still in place today, and that's why tribal interests become subordinate within US federalism. So these are important things to understand when we're talking about inequality across the United States. Here are some pictures of the development of this project in the 1970s. So these leases were signed in the 60s, and then in the 70s, you start to see all of the equipment moved in, a lot of the landscape starts changing. People start seeing the mines open and develop. And here you can see actually a field trip of Dene Navajo students going to the site, to a Black Mesa, where these large cranes that were stripping the landscape in order to get at the coal just beneath the surface, were in operation. So these are the way that this kind of information was presented to the Navajo public at the time. And here's a report that came out of the Washington Post in 1969 by the late reporter William Greider. You can see his byline at the top, where he actually interviewed some people who were working in the Department of Interior and learned about this offset of 3,400 acre feet a year in order to serve the needs of upper basin users. And there's more detail in the slide, but that's basically the meaning of this article and what it's doing within this larger narrative. Like I said, the division of the basin, of the Colorado Basin, goes right through the Navajo Nation. I showed you that map at the beginning of the presentation, and here's how that division is understood. These are not natural divisions. These are not like things where it's like, oh, here's naturally how water flows within these areas, even though it kind of has, because of the lines are not straight like the state lines. It looks like it's reflecting some sort of natural landscape, but actually these are political lines. There's a political division of the river between the upper basin states and the lower basin states, right through the middle of the Navajo Nation, in order to divide it in half and make sure that each of these states get some part of the Colorado River, regardless of whether or not Indian nations ever get access to these things. And then Mexico is also kind of an afterthought in the dividing and conquering of the river. What I am showing you in the right panel are actually in the Navajo people protesting some of this. These were pictures I took in 2012 during a proposed water settlement. So the water settlement in this case was for some access to the Little Colorado River, which is in the lower basin, which is a tributary of the Colorado River. So it's not for the Colorado River, but a tributary of the Colorado River. It's a settlement between the state of Arizona, the Navajo Nation, the Hopi tribe. I'm using their official name. And it was, for whatever water reaches the reservation after existing dams and diversions are taken into account upstream. Dams and diversion that were done in colonial times, before there was even a water code for the state, and without any consent from any of the indigenous nations there. So we're basically agreeing to the theft of water rights in order to just get a guarantee for whatever reaches the reservation from the Little Colorado River. So it starts up here in the White Mountains, and then it moves southwest toward the Colorado River. And the reservation is about here. So a lot of the diversions and damming happens up here, and then whatever's left, we can have access to over here. And a lot of these people were thinking that was an unfair agreement, or an unfair settlement. The other part of the settlement people objected to was at this time in 2012, Arizona was also requiring that the Navajo Nation renew the lease for that Navajo generating station by another 25 years. So we get a little bit of water here. We also have to renew this lease, which offsets our water claims for another 25 years, which would be 75 years in total for water to the Colorado River. And some of the benefits that we get, guaranteed water, it just basically means that they guarantee they won't even thieve the water anymore than they already have from now until forever. So, those are the kinds of agreements that Indian nations face to this day. This is 2012, less than 10 years ago, and we're talking about this kind of resource theft on totally unequal terms between the tribes and the state. So it just gives you a sense of what's going on out there. And so sometimes we think about these colonial problems as a past tense thing, and these are ongoing problems that we're facing, and the root of the problem goes back to 1969 to 1832. These are things that are in the past. So when we're talking about environmental crises as Indian tribes, we're talking about past events and contemporary and ongoing displacement. So here's an example of this. Some of the costs when the coal economy finally closed in 2019. Now, this was not something that was foreseen in 2012, but in 2019, by that time, the owner of the power plant was thinking that they didn't want to continue with the lease for another 25 years because they could find cheaper energy elsewhere. So they were like, okay, well, we did renew this lease with you, but we decide we're not going to uphold our end of the bargain. And so we're actually going to close this power plant. And so what ended up happening was we were notified late. We basically had this stopgap measure to extend the lease for just a couple more years so that we can get a few more years of revenue, so we can do some planning around the sudden collapse in our tribal budget from coal revenues. You know, many people lost their jobs or were transferred. People who were working at the mine site now are unemployed or retired. We still have no claims to the 3,400 acre feet of water. That's still ongoing within the courts, within the state court of Arizona. There's no proposed settlement that's being discussed right now, at least that I know of. And it might be behind closed doors, but it's not really an open conversation. And we're left with all the environmental costs, right? The mine site is under is under repair. It has to be left in fallow for 10 years without anybody being able to use that land or access it. And it might be permanently contaminated from the toxicity of unearthing all that coal, and then having that again on top of the surface and near the surface. So you can't do things, for example, like graze your sheep there without the risk of the sheep becoming contaminated through the eating of certain kinds of foods and grass on those lands. So there's a lot of costs, and who's paying the costs? It's the Dene Nation, it's the Navajo Nation. Who's benefiting? It's the state of Arizona. When they closed the coal economy that was built around the movement of CAP didn't shut down. They just found a new energy source. CAP to this day is the largest energy consumer in the state of Arizona. CAP has just saved money that it passes on to consumers. At least that's the justification they give us when they close the power plant. And that's something that that saving is realized by people in places like Phoenix and Tucson, and not the Navajo Nation. So we pay the costs. The settler colonial communities realize the benefits. There's inequality in a nutshell. I mean, there's a lot of complicated moving parts here, but I tried my best in this presentation to summarize a lot of these details in a way that to my hope makes some kind of sense to y'all. So yeah, just to leave you with some concluding thoughts, this multiple overlapping and current dystopias are lost on most commentaries on climate change, on our environmental crises, on just a way we fundamentally understand ideas of inequality. I think in some ways, it's not just inequality, it's colonialism. I think it's something we have to remember. And so in order to decolonize these big terms like the Anthropocene, like climate change, like our environmental crisis, we need to pay more attention to the history of colonialism and how that continues to perpetuate itself on Indian people and on Indian lands. So if you want more detail about some of the things that I talked about here, we have the citation that I'm putting here. I also have a paper that was recently published in Environment and Planning D about the Central Arizona Project that provides you that history in more detail. So thank you very much for your attention if you made it this far through my recorded presentation. And I appreciate you listening to these remarks. Have a good day. Enjoy your virtual conference.